two sides need to be talking about how to de-escalate. There are certain things that only China is able to do at this time. The tension is at an uncomfortably high level. That dynamic is weighing on the U.S. economy.
Hello, and welcome to The Call. I'm your host, Jay Sapsford, and here's today's question of the moment. Can the U.S. and China de-escalate? Tariffs are up, shipping traffic is slowing, and many Chinese goods are no longer reaching our shores, and so far, there's little sign of immediate relief. On Monday, the U.S. Chamber released a commission report on China's success in subsidizing industry for strategic goals. And that success for China has fueled exports and friction with China's trading partners. Today's guest says it is all part of Beijing's long-standing strategy to achieve greater self-reliance. So what does that mean for chances of a breakthrough on the trade front? Joining us now is Jeremie Waterman, president of the Chamber's China Center and host of next week's 15th Annual China Conference. Jeremie, welcome to The Call.
Great to be with you, Jay.
Let me start by asking, what is the latest on the trade front? Is there any sign of progress towards the deal between Washington and Beijing?
So, Jay, I think, first of all, the situation has escalated substantially, as everyone knows, but much faster, I think, than everyone thought was likely. I think the second point I'd make is that unlike the first Trump administration, when we had a China that was largely unprepared for an escalatory approach from the Trump administration, on this go-around, the Chinese had much more of a plan and were prepared to escalate in kind. Third point is the Chinese have been building out a toolkit since the first Trump administration to execute that plan that they developed. So we're in a situation now where the Trump administration has escalated. China has responded in kind, and we're at a very high level of escalate, or relatively high level of escalation. So can we de-escalate? I think what's noteworthy is over the past couple of weeks, the two sides, both on the Chinese side more recently, and certainly the U.S. side, have adopted I would say the tone has changed. Each side is starting to feel some pain, and each side is expressing an interest in trying to find a pathway to de-escalate, but that's easier said than done. Okay, so we'll get into the pain in a second here, but I'd like to ask you, what are the elements, the core elements of that toolkit that you mentioned? So in terms of the toolkit that Xi Jinping was very open about the need for China to develop, a big part of that is on the export control front. So China has largely built out an export control toolkit that resembles the U.S. export control toolkit with a hefty measure of extraterritoriality. Obviously, it's built around a different set of technologies. It's built around different products. In China's case, obviously, we've seen them brandish the critical mineral or China's chokehold or dominant position in critical minerals, more recently on rare earths. And so we're seeing obviously a lot of pressure, not only direct pressure on Western businesses, U.S. businesses, but also on U.S. allies to restrict supply. So that's one area. We've seen China also use sanctions in a manner akin to the way the U.S. uses sanctions. So last night in your update, and I would commend to our audience the daily update put out by Jeremie's China Center, which is the single best source of information on China in real time that you can find anywhere out there, you noted that the prices of, and I want to get the pronunciation right, dysprosium and terbium have hit record high levels. These are two rare earths that are more than 90% controlled by China here. Is that the sort of thing that China hopes will inflict pain and bring the U.S. to the bargaining table? Yeah, look, I think, taking a step back, China has, again, prepared for this. They had what they felt was a good plan of action if the Trump administration escalated. I think from Xi Jinping's perspective, who has been working on building a more self-reliant economy, as you noted at the outset, for the last decade plus, perhaps his approach here is to try to outlast the Trump administration. And so obviously minerals and earths are part of that effort to inflict pain, to slow U.S. manufacturing, and to bring the U.S. and the Trump administration to the table on more favorable negotiating terms.
So we've talked about the pressures on the U.S. Clearly, these trade restrictions would be part of that. But we also have, just consumer goods that are coming. We're looking at the prospect, at least, of shortages or price hikes on those sort of things. What other forces of pressure might bring the U.S. to the table?
Well, look, I think obviously we've seen a hiccup in the bond. We saw several weeks back, we saw a hiccup in the bond market. Growth by some measures was already slowing, even as the economy was in good shape when the Trump administration, a relatively good shape when the Trump administration came into office. But obviously, we're now seeing the impacts of tariffs begin to accumulate. And obviously, we're not talking just about tariffs vis-a-vis China. We're talking about tariffs vis-a-vis Canada, vis-a-vis Mexico, Europe, in essence, the whole world. And obviously, that is creating a tremendous amount of uncertainty for business the world over, certainly for U.S. companies. If you're sitting in the C-suite and you're thinking about making an investment, but you're not sure where your materials are going to come from, you're not sure what your market is going to look like, you're not sure what growth is going to look like, it's obviously really hard to make those kinds of decisions. And so obviously that dynamic as a whole is weighing on the U.S. economy. Now, let me say with regard to the Chinese economy,
right?
But I think obviously we in the United States and generally across the West, we're an open book, right? So we have a steady stream of reporting daily about all our works. Markets generally reflect in the West the state of the economy. They're more closely linked to the state of the economy.
Right.
In China, however, obviously we have much less reporting. There are far, as you know, Jay, as a former journalist, there are many fewer Western journalists in China, far fewer than there were years ago. There are intense restrictions on the ability of journalists and consultants and so forth to cover the Chinese economy. And so, just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, there was a report, yet another report about the Chinese government obscuring a lot of economic data. So I think it's much harder on the U.S. side, on the Western side, to track what's actually going on in the Chinese economy, and part of that is by design.
But despite that difficulty in tracking what's going on in the Chinese economy, we do have some high-level understanding that China is facing some pretty dire economic circumstances, particularly in the hinterland, with the crash in the real estate bubble over the past couple of years, and you've got deflationary pressures. I wonder what your thoughts are on all that.
Yeah, absolutely, Jay. The Chinese economy was not in good shape heading into this trade conflict or this trade war. It had not emerged from the COVID crisis in the way that the Chinese leadership thought it would or wanted it to. Obviously, you alluded to the real estate bubble that popped, and where you continue to have a downward cycle. Obviously, debt and deflationary challenges. The Chinese economy was, I think, starting to stabilize at a relatively low level of growth just prior to this, but obviously now with many factories under great pressure, local finances, again, as they don't have that tax revenue flowing in, again, under pressure, obviously, and the leadership still having enormous ambitions in terms of the focus on science and technology, all of the subsidies for the Chinese military and so forth, right? You see, I think it's fair to say that there's quite a bit of pressure on the overall financial situation and economic situation in China today.
So speaking of the financial situation, we just had one of our audience members ask, what is the status of potential Chinese company delisting requirements at U.S. exchanges? What could we see there?
Yeah. So look, I think the delisting issue has been out there for quite some time. Obviously, this is a long-running concern with regard to two issues, really. One is the overall transparency of the Chinese system and whether or not audits and so forth can be conducted. The other issue, which has been out there for quite some time, is more of a philosophical question. Should Chinese companies be able to tap U.S. capital markets, obviously particularly Chinese companies that may pose a national security concern, that may have ties to the Chinese military, and the U.S. government has a number of lists. We've seen some indications that the Trump administration is interested in looking at options. Obviously, there are a number of ways that number of tools that they could use. There are certain lists that the Treasury Department keeps. There's a list that the Defense Department keeps. There are tools that the SEC has and the PCAOB have. So I think, I think this is something that's under consideration, but obviously I want to go back to the de-escalation point, right? I think there's a mutual interest given the economic challenges, the economic vulnerability of both sides, as well as concerns about the broader global economic picture, as we saw at the IMF at the spring meetings of the Bank Fund, where I think there's an interest on both sides in trying to find a pathway to de-escalate, mutually de-escalate the tariffs. The question is to de-escalate to what level, right? And that's, again, easier to get to a level that is trade supporting, trade facilitating, as opposed to a level where we are today that is trade prohibiting. That's not an easy thing to engineer, given the range of issues, the lack of trust, the geopolitical concerns, national security and economic security concerns that permeate both sides.
So you mentioned the global implications. One of our audience members is asking, what happens if both the U.S. and China ask other countries to take sides?
Well, I think we're starting to see that, right? I think embedded in the Trump administration strategy is an effort I think they've been open about this, to use tariffs to leverage outcomes that are first beneficial for the U.S. economy, but also beneficial in terms of a joint stand or harmonization, greater harmonization with regard to some of the measures that the U.S. has used to restrict technology that would have a national security implication that would weigh on, potential conflicts that would conflict zones, right? Whether it's South China Sea or other parts, various scenarios around Taiwan, obviously, which is a serious concern.
And just picking up on what you just said, the Chamber just commissioned a report of the Rhodium Group called Made in China 2025. Some of the takeaways on there was that this is a program that's been in place for about the past 10 years. It's been, it's had difficult, it's changed its name on a number of occasions, but the goals of the project, which was to invest in strategic industries, direct subsidies towards those industries in order to increase self-reliance. All of that remained in place over the past 10 years. How successful has that been, according to this report that you've just released?
Yeah, look, according to the report, I think it's been quite successful. It's come at a cost. It's come at significant cost for China in terms of wasted resources, because they've thrown a tremendous amount of resources at the initiative and at many of these sectors in terms of the funds that they've used, the tax breaks, the direct subsidies, and so forth. It's also come with a lot of externalities that have created quite a bit of friction across the global economic landscape. Some of this is when you look at overcapacity in the electric vehicle space or in the solar panel space, or some of these areas where China has micro-targeted some future areas where we could see overcapacity, like legacy semiconductors, even memory in the advanced space, right? So I think overall, the policy has been successful, but it's also generating quite a bit of friction, and it's generated costs for China. And China may be looking, as the report highlights, at lower growth going forward because of some of these wasted resources. Let me add one final point: is that the program has not been a success across the board. And so while China has had success in certain categories of information communication technology products and electric vehicles and other renewable areas, obviously shipbuilding, robotics, they've had some success. Certainly bioeconomy is another area. They've had less success in areas like advanced semiconductors, aviation, right? Commercial aerospace is an area where they're still quite dependent. And it's also the program has bred new dependencies, right? And so we saw China institute some tariff exemptions recently, kind of very quietly, because there are things that they need to continue to import for their own economy, just as the U.S. needs to continue to import things from China for our economy, for our
So what specifically were targeting these exemptions?
Well, I think you saw things from everything from drugs and pharmaceuticals to medical technology imports to certain chemicals, advanced semiconductors were exempted in instances, even as the Chinese have changed the rules of origin around importing semiconductors from the United States. So they kind of went back on that a little bit. Aircraft parts, right? Half of the Chinese fleet is Boeing aircraft, so they need to continue to import those parts to make sure those planes are in good shape.
I wanted to ask about spillover effects here. We've had a number of our members ask questions about whether or not there might be some sort of travel restriction. We're also, while there's the trade war going on, we also have a geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States. I wonder whether the trade war can affect some of these other areas.
Well, first of all, in terms of a travel restriction, I would say let's hope not. I think the general view is the U.S. and China need to be engaged right now. I think that the tension is at an uncomfortably high level. The two sides need to be talking about how to de-escalate, restricting travel, tourism. U.S. tourism has obviously dropped off quite a bit overall, right? So having that people-to-people engagement, is important. Obviously, you can never rule that out. I was meeting with a Chinese group yesterday, and they had no issues going through customs. I asked them; it was quite a smooth process for them entering the United States. I think the process for U.S. executives, travelers to China, continues to be smooth. I don't think it's in either side's interest, honestly, to go that route. But obviously, there are certain classes of individuals. Obviously, if you're a former national security official on either side, you're probably going to get more attention as you're entering the country, right? A former government employee, right? Than those who are going to do business and so forth. So.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question before we wrap up here, but are there opportunities to advance services outcomes in negotiations, such as we did in phase one, or is it really going to be the focus on goods and on the goods trade?
Well, look, I think there are lots of opportunities in principle to advance outcomes. Obviously, there were a number of outcomes in the phase one agreement tied to services, particularly financial services, payment services. Obviously, it's a strength for the United States. But I think, obviously, this administration appears to be heavily focused, when I say this, the Trump administration, heavily focused on reindustrialization, on outcomes for U.S. manufacturers. So I think there is this question about what, in a negotiation, we still don't know, I think, the priorities really on either side. I will say that, one of the issues that precipitated some of this escalation, or the first action out of the box for the Trump administration, was the issue of fentanyl. And I think there, maybe a ray of hope is the two sides are continuing to talk. I think our sense is that the Chinese side does now have a concrete list of asks. And I think the ball is now, what we're picking up is that the ball is in China's court in terms of whether it wants to follow through on some of those asks from the Trump administration. And obviously, progress on fentanyl could de-escalate tensions. It's a priority for the president, and help to maybe lay the foundation for a negotiation. I think some of those issues are, some of the structural issues are going to be quite difficult to address in any talks. But there's always, I think, an opportunity. Obviously, China made a commitment back when it joined the WTO to allow U.S. e-payments companies into its market. Obviously, there have been a couple that have gotten access, but there are others that have still not gotten that access, notwithstanding China's promise to do so many, many years ago. So there's opportunities, but obviously we need to get to a level of de-escalation first, so that the environment is better and the two sides can sit down and engage more constructively than they have to date.
These are such consequential developments. I could talk to you about this all day, but let me just wrap by asking you one final question, Jeremie. Are we going to see a solution that allows me to continue buying cheap Chinese goods online? I mean, I think that's what everyone really wants to know here.
Are we going to see a solution? It's a good question, and you know, I'm not sure. I think we know part of it. Let me say, I think we know part of the answer to that. Obviously, with the de minimis exemption being eliminated, obviously, you know, that in part is reducing the avenues for very low cost imports into the United States. Look, I think the hope would be to get to a level of de-escalation, mutual de-escalation on tariffs that allows those consumer goods. Obviously, you know, this is something that's been in the news recently quite a bit in terms of toys and Halloween costumes. I mean, I think it's understood there are certain things that only China is able to do at this time.
Right.
Obviously, consumer electronics. That's why we have exemptions for there aren't alternatives for sourcing of those electronics. There isn't going to be sourcing for the Halloween season or for Christmas lights. Those are things that China's uniquely able to do. I think the hope would be, though, that we have an approach toward China that emphasizes, you know, that protects national security, that protects our crown jewels, but is less focused on things that benefit the U.S. economy and benefit consumers, right? And so that's, I think, where we want to get to. But I unfortunately don't have a crystal ball, Jay, and obviously we'll continue to watch and track very closely on behalf of the membership.
Jeremie Waterman, President of the Chamber's China Center, thank you so much for joining us today. All right, our audience has had their shot of informational espresso and is ready to tackle the day. Missed a live episode? Catch the replay on our website, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. You can also listen to The Call's podcast edition on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.